3 million Teslas sold in China in 2025 is a focus of our show today. One of the analysts at UBS suggested that number would be 1.6 million globally for all countries. So that's the focus of our show for today, and we look forward to reviewing the details that deliver those numbers. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. Wanted to thank our Patreon supporters as well as our subscribers. We greatly appreciate you, and if you find the show a good one, please take time to like and subscribe. So there's an interesting phenomenon. The folks at UBS came out with a price or a sales target for Tesla for all countries of 1.6 million vehicles in 2025. And we thought this was interesting because we're forecasting about a 3 million sales in China alone in 2025. And we therefore are inclined to take a look at the numbers as to why there'll be 3 million vehicles sold in China. And then if we see similar growth as in a doubling or tripling of sales by Tesla elsewhere, it sort of implies about a 6 million vehicle year for Tesla in 2025. And then, there are some huge implications for that when it comes to the stock price, which is why we wanted to cover that, because as we go into earnings, we're going to find out more about how well Tesla is doing in terms of perhaps orders as well as units sold. And therefore, we can sort of bake in those numbers to anticipate sort of where things are going for the company and therefore the stock. So I wanted to start our show off today with just a brief note on process in China. We have a former client who's actually a professor in global health at Stanford. And what he informed me was the fact that in China, something like 90% of the men, I looked it up, and actually 70% of the men and 2.8% of the women smoke. So the question is sort of, why does it matter? Well, it turns out that the Chinese government is the owner of all the tobacco companies. And so they have a mandate relative to number of cigarettes needed to be purchased or sold each year. And they pretty much have a quota for all these different parts of the country. And you basically better buy your cigarettes or else. So basically, we now know why they're such a huge, and not smoking could be bad for your business and freedom health. So we use this as an illustration to sort of walk into the whole discussion of what might happen when it comes to EVs. So what I wanted to review with you is the fact that the Chinese government has stated that the goal for 2025 is to have 25% of the vehicles sold be EVs. How that plays out is that right now they're selling about 25 million vehicles in general. So if we look at 25% of that, let's call it 6.5 million vehicles, are theoretically going to be EVs by 2025. And then the next issue is, out of those 6 million, what percentage sort of fit Tesla's price range? Range as well as production costs. So if we assume that Tesla is still at 40,000 for the bottom end vehicle that's coming out of China, we're kind of expecting that number to drop into that late 20s, early 30s zone as we achieve scale across more factories. But what this brings up is basically the idea that something like half the market or so is sort of sub the price range that Tesla typically operates in. So therefore, that side of the market is sort of preserved for domestic producers in China. And these are vehicles, $10,000 or $15,000, $20,000, 100 miles of range, something of that ilk. So if we take a look at the half of the market that Tesla really operates in now and theoretically should operate in then, we're now in a situation where you're looking at about 3.5 million vehicles, maybe 4 million vehicles in Tesla's segment. And based on Tesla's achieving market share domestically in the US, Europe, and from what we can see in China, of about 80%, you're looking at 80% of, let's say, 4 million vehicles by then. And this is how we're getting to a number of about 3 million Teslas sold. Now, we sort of generally threw these numbers out, and one of our viewers pointed out that, well, wait a second, their current factory is only able to produce a certain number of vehicles, and that number is, as we know, for the top end they've discussed for this factory, it's about 500,000 vehicles a year. So we totally agree. The build out to get to the number that the government wants by 2025 has not occurred, but we're looking forward to part of the number is sort of get a feel for the market reaction to Tesla's vehicles. And the early signs are good. I mean, 10 weeks of backup, there are all these elements that sort of give a general feel for the numbers that are rolling through. And, there seems not to be any shortage of demand, et cetera, based on, number of people queuing up, et cetera. So, there's a lot of momentum that we can see, and what we're looking for is that momentum in the form of comments made about China by the company that really go beyond what we're expecting from the numbers when it comes to sales and revenue for the coming quarter on the 29th. So the other thing I thought is interesting about it is if you look back at the growth of Tesla's stock price, most of the increase in the value of their stock price has really kind of followed the completion of the China operations. So, initially there was a discussion of can they get it done on time, then can they get the permits and all these other things. And as all this has been confirmed and there's been seen visibly vehicles rolling out en masse, to be delivered to customers, there continues to be a strengthening of a sense of, this is happening and this is going well. So there need not be any worry about Tesla actually delivering on its possibilities. There are a few elements. We've kind of been doing a way, no way process from Wayne's World, and we're kind of walking down the way side of this argument. So one of the other way elements that's sort of coming in when we look at Tesla China is something called the halo effect. So if you look around in the US, think of the Corvette or some of the other high-end vehicles that are out there, there's been a trend where consumers kind of watch that top-end vehicle and it starts to affect people's sense of, hey, that's a company whose products I aspire to own, and then over time people get access. So one of the non-discussed elements of Tesla is it's been in China for a very long time. The largest Tesla charging station is in Shanghai inside of a shopping center area, I believe on 3 floors. And I was actually surprised to learn, I definitely should confirm this, that Tesla actually has 6 facilities in Shanghai alone related to its vehicles, including both mall-based introduction centers for customers. I think there are 3, and then there are actually, I think 3 service centers, but I'll have to double check that. But the general point is there's a pretty large footprint of Tesla already in the country. There's a sidebar note here. We all know about the coronavirus and the fact that it's affecting a lot of people, and it's only 500 miles away from Tesla. We haven't seen any impactors on the company yet because it's a holiday period, and we expect there are probably some of the employees who went to visit family in those areas that may have a difficult time getting back to be involved in production. So that's one aspect. Another aspect might be what happens to sale of vehicles that are supposed to go to that area, because Wuhan actually has a Tesla facility there as well. And so we'd expect that to be shut down. But from what we can see, there's a movement of vehicles that might go to one location that's actually going to other places, given that they can't obviously sell or deliver anything in that area until the crisis is cleared. So I definitely think it's a problem. I don't think you can ignore it, but I do think that it can be addressed by the fact that the market's so large and Tesla's penetration for the lower end of the market has been so small given where they've been priced previously. The next thing that we wanted to look at, and part of the reason we discussed the whole issue of smoking and how the Chinese government sort of forced people down that path, is the fact that there are a bunch of laws that were put in place by China to spur demand. They did some rebates both to companies and individuals, and those are sort of ending. But now you're in the position where it takes 5 years to get permit for a new ICE vehicles, whereas with EVs there is none. They evidently are waiving taxes, and obviously there's no tariff when it comes to Tesla. So we have a number of sort of core elements to how the Chinese government is spurring demand. And I guess the biggest spur is that if you don't buy one or an EV of some type, you might be walking. And so that brings up the next question of, well, what about the fact that people might just run en masse to the lowest priced Chinese vehicles? And there's a concept that's called caveat emptor, which means buyer beware. So one of the things that's been going on in China that we've covered in other shows is the fact that there's a very large demand for luxury vehicles. BMW's largest sort of out-of-country destination is actually China. And what's been happening is that luxury vehicles that are foreign is one way that consumers are avoiding having to deal with some of the headaches of local buy and own in China. So other elements of that is, given that most of the vehicles in China are under 5-year-old companies that have entered this space, a number of consumers are experiencing challenges. One, warranties run out after 3 years versus Tesla's 8 years. Two, there's difficulty getting spare parts as consumers transition, into EVs. They're looking for, if they can afford it, the best participant in the marketplace, and in this case, it's Tesla. Number three, the retention of resale value of Tesla experiences, and we've discussed this, 70% after year one versus the average of 35% for Chinese domestic produced vehicles. Numbers like that are obvious to us and obvious to consumers, have to put up their dollars for these vehicles and don't necessarily want to buy something that is going to have issues. And then with Tesla retaining about 60% of its resale value after 3 years, we are now seeing sort of a collection of elements that are driving the focus of the Chinese consumer on being Tesla customers rather than just picking and rolling with a domestic product. So the wait list for Tesla basically is rather long. And so we've sort of covered it, and we'll probably cover it more as we move forward. I also wanted to, there's a sidebar note relative to the number of cars, and that is, when you think of a vehicle being sold, you don't often think of add-on services. So add-on performance by Tesla or other products or services that are rendered through the vehicle that represent a broader earnings potential. So it's an interesting sort of collection of circumstances. I briefly wanted to touch on the no way side, like this is not going to happen. Number one is maybe a shift in government interest. I think that's possible. Unlikely. Two, a global slowdown and how it affects Tesla sales has been something that many people have been discussing. The issue there is that one of the things I found interesting about slowdowns, and it's hitting Tesla, is that in a slowdown, you tend to have people having to be more efficient because they have to stretch dollars. And when you're dealing with electric versus use of ICE vehicles, there's no doubt there that you're getting more efficiency and therefore I think better throughput. however you're using your vehicles, particularly with an electric vehicle in that case. There's another issue, which is competitors like VW closing the gap with Tesla. I mean, the Taycan is a decent product, even though it's 200 miles of range. And I definitely think by then we'll see a closing of the gap between Tesla and major competitors, both domestically in China and internationally, when it comes to all of the big firms around the world. I really think that one of the weird things happening on that one is something called a network effect, where when you have enough of a product in a place, all these things start to happen where spare parts and mechanics know how to work on it, or just consumers happy with the products. There's just a whole bunch of issues that pop up with friends introducing each other to the vehicle. There's a large collection of issues that happens all at the same time that nets out to the fact that the competition may arrive, but it's kind of like, look at the iPhone or look at the Android phone right now. You're looking at a situation where you could actually have a very small number of players gaining most of the market share because of one reason, and that is differentiation. How do you differentiate yourself if there's how do you differentiate yourself as a company from another? So for example, if you came out with the iPhone today and it was the equivalent of what Apple is doing, given all the services behind that phone, it'd be very difficult to get someone to give up their iPhone and move over to another product. And so when that new iPhone comes out, people have to make the decision, new phone or stay with Apple, and think of all the products and services given up by those consumers behind that product if they leave. And we think that these are the kind of things that represent the future as Tesla gains share and its ability to retain customers over time. So the final note that we were going to make that popped up here is the economy a scale killer? So one of the lurking issues happening right now for a whole industry is the fact that Tesla is making money because they have economies of scale at the battery factory. And a lot of competitors are in a tough position because they don't have their own batteries currently, and they're having to sell the vehicles they're selling at a loss. And so as Tesla gets bigger across the globe, they have an ability to make money and in a price range that others lose. And so the question starts to become, how much money can those other firms afford to lose before they capitulate? And I think that this is a lurking issue for the Chinese companies as well. We think that, we've already seen a number of bankruptcies for domestic firms, which is also affecting consumer confidence in local producers. But now as Tesla enters and starts selling across all segments, how many of these firms can hang on given that they've established themselves, but they don't have enough throughput to be able to be competitive? And so therefore they have to fold, and the more of them that fold, obviously the more nervous consumers become at not going with the best brand in the marketplace. So I guess I would say let's keep our eyes peeled for everything China that emerges from the earnings announcement, because I think the earnings per se will be good, but not as big a deal as how are you going to grow to justify the high stock price that you're enjoying. And things like what they're doing in solar, as well as what's going on with China and its growth, and how and when the German growth sort of comes into play. All these sort of future values are very much shaping forward progress of the company. And so we wanted to micro focus on Tesla in China because something like 3 million vehicles we think is possible. If the network effect takes over as we've described, it wouldn't be a shocker to see the real number rise into that 4 or even 5 million vehicle zone, because when you look at a Tesla and its performance and other attributes, it really is a better solution for a lot of people than the ICE vehicles. So I think that you end up taking a lot of share away from people that might have gone towards an ICE luxury vehicle instead. So we look forward to your input on this issue, et cetera. I think that, it's a fun one to keep track of, because if there are a whole bunch of naysayers throwing out numbers, and Tesla does 3 times those numbers. I think the results in terms of stock price impact and growth of the company and success of Tesla is all attached to that. And I can see when you add robotaxis and things like that, there's a whole collection of services that now become pretty amazing in terms of, what the results are for consumers. We're at a point in the show we typically take questions. You guys I know have been firing a bunch of them between each other, and we're going to copy and paste them at the bottom of the show as we usually do. I wanted to also note that there was a question posed to us regarding why it was that companies' stock prices tend to drop between 3 and 10% just after earnings are announced, and then they switch over. After some thought on this and review, there are a few things that the biggest thing that pops up is the question of who dominates stock price or stock activity at certain times. So, for example, what you'll notice is that the hedge funds are able to very quickly move once something is announced. They can plug into models and they can drive trading immediately on other platforms globally, if not locally. So they're able to react very quickly to what happens. One aspect of this is something called a 3-day rule. So you've noticed a few times with Tesla where the stock price has perhaps dropped, and then you have about 3 days for the analysts to rewrite their report, present them to institutions, and then all of a sudden the stock price will start rising again, driven by the fact that large institutions have to work on longer time horizons than the hedge funds will. Hedge funds being seconds or minutes, and institutions typically months, years, decades perhaps. So that transition in who's focused on the stock is part of the reason you can see a dip. Clearly, Tesla has sort of gone the opposite of that. After the last earnings were announced, the stock price, surged forward, and then it continued to surge as, there were more analysts sort of sense of what was going on to support Tesla's success. So we look forward to sort of getting at the meat of what's going on with this and how everything looks from the Tesla side or from the China side coming over. I'd say that, like I said, there's a bunch of mysteries. I could throw a few more of them out, but I think we'll know more afterwards. And, we look forward to diving more into these as we get more data that we can work off of. At any rate, wanted to remind you of our usual health tips. Don't forget to do 25 leg lifts per day. Allow to strengthen your quad muscles, reduces knee issues. Try out the 5-2 diet or one of those others. Might be helpful. Also wanted to encourage you to don't go to bed within 2 hours eating, preferably 4. Also wanted to note fried foods maybe once a week to cut down the potential of that being an issue as well. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Tschüss German, au revoir French, Lihit Rot, Hebrew, Choda Hafez Farsi, Zdravstvuyte, hello in Russian, Ni hao ma, hello in Chinese, Hedge do, for our friends in Sweden, Dobry dzień, I believe Polish, from our friend Vladimir. Thanks once again for joining us, and we look forward to your comments after the show. Please reminder, like and subscribe, and we could use some help on Patreon as well. Have a great day. Bye for now, and thanks once again for joining us.